Welcome, students. In this session, I will discuss a brief analysis of the story Odour of Chrysanthemums. Odour of Chrysanthemums was first published in the year 1909, a different version which transformed and expanded the concluding section in which Elizabeth Bates reflects on her married life in the presence of the body of her husband was published in 1914 in the Prussian Officer and Other Stories. The story is a narration of a moment in the life of Mrs. Elizabeth Bates after the accidental death of her husband Walter Bates. When the story begins, a locomotive engine comes chugging along the tracks, pulling seven loaded cars behind it. It's a late afternoon in the autumn, nearing dusk in England's coal country. The locomotive pulls into the collieries loading area as various miners make their way home. Elizabeth Bates emerges from the chicken coop, watching the miners walk along the railroad. She turns and calls her son John and chides him for tearing off the petals of the chrysanthemums and scattering them on the path. She picks a few of the flowers and, after holding them against her cheek, sticks a spring in her apron. The story's controlled analysis of the harsh industrial setting and of Elizabeth Bates' psychological transformation has been widely admired. The harsh, bleak mining villages of Nottinghamshire, which Lawrence knew so well, are powerfully evoked in Odour of Chrysanthemums and contrasted with the unfettered beauties of the natural world. In fact, it was believed that Lawrence's greatest achievement is this short fiction. The story is read in three parts based on the plot it offers. Let us look into the part 1, Waiting. Mrs. Bates' husband was supposed to come home from his mining work after completing his shift for the evening snack. She waits for him. She gives her children evening snack to eat and asks them to eat while anxiously thinking of her husband with a grim fail in the heart. She thinks he might have gone to drink at the pub. Her father also informs her that her husband, Walter, had gone on another drinking binge and was heard bragging in the local pub. With no sign of Walter, Elizabeth continues preparing the meal. Her daughter Annie enters the room, and Elizabeth mildly scolds her for being late. She asks Annie whether she has seen Walter. She has not. The children play quietly, afraid of angering Elizabeth, who sews in her rocking chair. After a while, she sends them to bed, although Annie protests as Walter has not come home yet. Elizabeth states that when he does appear, he will be all but unconscious from drinking. Putting the children to bed, she angrily and fearfully resumes her sewing. At 8 o'clock, she leaves the house. She makes her way to a row of dwellings and enters a passage between the two of the houses, asking Mrs. Wrigley whether her husband is at home. Mrs. Wrigley answers that he has had his dinner and then gone briefly to the pub and that she will go find him. Thinking of him makes her uneasy. Let us look into the part 2, the search. After Elizabeth has waited for another 45 minutes, her mother in law enters the cottage crying hysterically. Elizabeth asks whether Walter is dead, but all her mother in law tells her is that he has been in a serious accident. As the mother in law laments and defends her son's gradual slide into the battery, a miner arrives to inform the women that Walter has been dead for hours, smothered after a cave in. Elizabeth's mother in law dissolves into tears, and Elizabeth quickly silences her, afraid that her wailing will wake the children. She moves into the parlor to clear a space on the floor where the body can be laid. She spreads cloths on the floor to protect the carpet, takes out a clean shirt to air it, and then waits in the pantry. Mrs. Bates is struck with shock, unable to figure out if it is real or not. Her behavior is weird. Comforting her children, she enters into an imagination whereupon she thinks how she would have had nursed him to life and got her relationship rekindled. Both Elizabeth and senior Mrs. Bates share their opinions on Walter to each other. For mother, he is a lovely boy. For Elizabeth, a morally fragile, handsome young man who could have made his life better. Let us now look into the third part, death and revelation. Shortly, the pit manager and another man arrive with a body and a stretcher. As they bring Walter into the parlor and lay him on the floor, one of the men accidentally trips over a vase of chrysanthemums. Elizabeth quickly cleans up the Walter and broken glass. Annie, who has woken up, calls from upstairs, and Elizabeth rushes up to comfort her. The men try to silence Walter's mother, who is still sobbing loudly. With Annie finally calm and the men gone, Elizabeth and her mother in law prepare to undress, clean, and lay out the body. Elizabeth embraces the body, trying to make a connection to her husband's still warm calves. She and Walter's mother wash the body. Elizabeth presses her cheek against the body but is repulsed by the dead flesh. Rinsing the dirt from the unmarked body, Elizabeth revisits her life with Walter and value his work and their life together. She realized that they never really knew each other and that she might have been to blame for the failure their marriage had become. Revelation of Elizabeth is the aspect which has been added by Lawrence in his next edition of the story, where Elizabeth revisits her life and marriage and feels she is equally guilty of their unsuccessful marriage. She laments her marriage and the hand she had in its failure. Walter's mother rouses Elizabeth from her musing. Elizabeth, unable to weep, goes to fetch a shirt. With difficulty, she dresses Walter, covering him in a sheet and locking in the parlor door. She tidies the kitchen, afraid and ashamed of the harsh realizations she has come to as a result of Walter's death. The story of a fragile happiness, the accidental death of her husband, Elizabeth comes to recognize her own failures in the relationship and realizes that she has denied and ignored his essential humanity. In this brilliantly narrated story, with its masterly use of foreshadowing or anticipation to heighten suspense, the chrysanthemums are recurrent image of Elizabeth's husband Walter and their marriage. What makes the story great and really disturbing is that through Mrs. Bates' situation, Lawrence could ultimately be suggesting that we are all ultimately alone and separate even from our loved ones. Thank you.